Welcome to Sunday Sermons. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Numbers, chapter 20, verses 1 through 20. And I'll read verses 10 through 12 for us now, as we prepare to hear from lead pastor Travis Simone as he helps us continue in our summer series titled, In the Wilderness. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them."
I recently heard an interview with the late pastor and author Eugene Peterson. He's well known for his translation of the Bible entitled The Message, but he was also an active working pastor planting a church just outside of Baltimore, Maryland. At one point in his life, he was facing burnout. He realized that if he went on the way he went on, he was not going to make it in pastoral ministry. His congregation, and I'm not asking, this is not me asking, I'm just telling you what happened. His congregation gave him a year off. Just repeating what I heard. His congregation gave him a year off. And he comes back from the year, and he said, 3 months later, I was in the exact same place. 3 months later, exactly the same place. I was having a conversation with a coach that I meet with several years ago when I actually felt like I was in that place, like I was on the verge of burnout. And I talked to him about maybe stringing together 2 whole weeks off. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Travis, you can't vacation your way out of burnout. You have to learn how to show up differently." You see, we all think the answer to the wilderness places of our lives is to leave the wilderness, to get out. Eugene Peterson got a year out of the difficulty he was facing. We think the answer is to leave. But the message of Numbers chapter 20 is this: don't leave before you learn. In verse 1, we learn that Israel comes to Kadesh in the first month, which when put together with the timing of Aaron's death later in this chapter, it's the first month of their 40th year in the wilderness. We also learn in verse 1 that Miriam dies at Kadesh. These are signals that the older wilderness generation is coming to an end. God's people are about to leave the wilderness. And God has a message for them and for us. Don't leave before you learn. Again, go back to verse 1 on your song sheets. In verse 1, Israel is in the same place where they refused to enter the promised land back in chapters 13 and 14. A place called Kadesh. Kadesh is the place of the decisive rebellion of the book of Numbers. Israel's refusal to trust God's power, provision, and promises enough to enter Canaan, ironically called the promised land, which they did not trust his promise for the promised land. That's where they are again. And my question is, why would God bring them back to that place of great failure? Why not leave it in the past as they're almost about to exit the wilderness and go into the promised land? Don't leave before you learn. There's one more signal in this chapter that you need to pick up on to fully understand what is going on. They are facing the same test, too, that they faced just weeks after crossing the Red Sea. There is no water. In fact, they're actually back at the same location where they faced that same test back in Exodus 17. It's called Meribah. Let me read you the test from Exodus 17. Again, weeks after crossing the Red Sea, and Moses called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" You see, at Meribah, they succumbed to the persistent temptation to believe that God's presence is dependent on the pleasantness of our circumstances. And God brings them back to that exact spot. If Yogi Berra was preaching the sermon on Numbers 20, he would say, it's deja vu all over again. Don't leave before you learn. Don't leave the wilderness, Israel, before you learn the lessons of the wilderness. And there are several lessons we can learn from our passage today. Lesson number 1, pay attention. God rarely shows up the same way twice. Pay attention. God rarely shows up the same way twice. Look at verse 8 on your song sheets. Take the staff and assemble the congregation. This is God speaking. You and Aaron, your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and to their cattle. God's instructions in Numbers 20 are a bit different than his instructions in Exodus 17. Back in Exodus 17, God tells Moses to strike the rock and water will come forth to quench the congregation's thirst. This is exactly what Moses does in Numbers chapter 20, verse 11. He strikes the rock. In fact, he does it twice. The issue is this time God's instructions were to tell the rock, to speak to it, to yield its water. And that subtle difference holds an important wilderness lesson. Pay attention. God rarely shows up the same way twice. For Noah, it was a homemade boat that saved him from the floodwaters. For Jonah, it was a great fish that kept him from drowning in the storm-churned sea. Naaman the Syrian, he wasn't saved from water, he was saved dipping himself into the water. At the Exodus, God parted the Red Sea for Israel to cross. Entering the promised land, God's people were told to wade into the Jordan River at flood stage and wait there in the rushing water before it would part. Those are only differences in the stories dealing with water. And look at how God shows up differently each time. My favorite example of this is the story of Elijah running to hear from God on Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is just another name in the Bible for Mount Sinai. Elijah, on the verge of burnout in his own wilderness season, flees to Horeb, flees to Sinai to get a fresh revelation from God. He thinks if God spoke to Moses there, maybe God will speak to me there. He stands there on Mount Sinai and says, okay, God, let me have it. And the famous story in 1 Kings chapter 19 says that there was this great wind, but that God was not in the wind. Then there was a great earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake. Then there was a great and powerful fire that descended on top of the mountain. You think this has got to be it, and God's not in the fire. And if you've been to Sunday school, you know there is next a gentle whisper, or in Hebrew, the sound of fine silence. Simon and Garfunkel were paying attention in Sunday school. It was the sound of silence. And that contrast, sound and silence in Hebrew, is an idiom for just a barely audible whisper. And God's there in the whisper. Now, what just a casual reading of the story misses is that at the dawn of creation, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. That word for spirit is the same word in Hebrew for wind. Some translations say there was a great wind from God hovering over the waters. The wind of God swept over the waters. Elijah must have thought, surely this is it. This is my new creation moment. The wind is here, but God's not in the wind. When Moses is on top of Sinai, about to receive the 10 Commandments, what happens? There is an earthquake. The mountain is shaking violently, Exodus says. This is it, Elijah must think. The mountain shook for Moses, it must be shaking for me. And my favorite, the fire. Remember, God speaks to Moses from the shaking mountain. And there's fire on top of the mountain. He calls Moses up, and I love this verse in Exodus 19. It says, and Moses went up, as in into the fire he goes. Elijah thinks, just as Moses entered the fire, this is my moment. I've got to enter the fire. Except God wasn't in any of that. God forced Elijah to pay attention. I'm not going to do it the same way for you, Elijah. Think of Jesus' miracles. One leper is touched. Others are told to go and show themselves to the priest. One blind man has mud placed on his eyes. Another is simply told his faith has made him well and he sees. The storm is calmed at Jesus' command, but the water becomes wine only after the servants have to fill the stone jars. So why doesn't God show up the same way twice? Why are there not discernible patterns that we can identify so we can be certain of what God will do in any situation? First, God's not a magician. It's not magic tricks he's doing here. God doesn't show up the same way twice because God is pushing us to pay attention. God wants us looking for him, praying to him, and thinking about what he might be doing in our circumstances. Moses assumed that God would provide for his people the same way God provided the last time. So in your wilderness, closely consider, what is God up to? What are the new and surprising ways he wants to provide, or the new and surprising lessons he wants to teach? Lesson number one, pay attention. God rarely shows up the same way twice. Don't leave before you learn. Lesson number two, disobedience denies us what we long for. Look at verse 5 with me. This is the people speaking. And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place, pay attention to this, for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Well, there is an answer to the people's question if they want to hear it. Moses and Aaron did not bring the assembly of the Lord out of Egypt. The Lord brought them out of Egypt. And the Lord did not bring them out to wander in the wilderness. The Lord brought them out to bring them into the promised land. And the promised land contained exactly what they long for here in Numbers 20. I'm going to take you back to Exodus 13 when they explored it with the spies. Listen to what the spies bring back in Numbers 13:21. And they came to the valley of Eshcol and cut down from there a branch with a single cluster of grapes. That's a vine. And they carried it on a pole between two of them. And they also brought, get this, pomegranates and figs. What were they longing for in the wilderness? Vines, figs, pomegranates. It's exactly what they had access to in the promised land. And in disobedience, they refused to enter that land. And in disobedience, they deny themselves the very things they now long for. We long for financial security, but in disobedience, we seek it apart from giving back to God who has given everything for us. Say, I'll do that later when I have a little bit more, when I'm a little bit more secure. And we end up like the person described in Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24. One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. We long for success, but in disobedience, we work beyond our limits in ways that lead to an embarrassing lack of success or even downright failure with our spouses and children. We long for a relational connection, but in disobedience, seek it through sex outside of God's design in marriage. We end up feeling abandoned and alone. We long for a relationship with our Creator, but in disobedience, we place ourselves in a place of authority that rightly belongs to God, only to end up outside the garden, outside our true home, desperately looking for something, anything to let us back in. You see, so often what we resent God for, thinking we don't have this because God has withheld it from us, the truth is, it is something we forfeited through our disobedience. Disobedience denies us what we long for. Don't leave before you learn. Lesson number 3, emotions can deceive. Not only does Moses speak to the people instead of speaking to the rock, Moses lets them have it. Look at verse 10. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Hear now, you rebels," Moses says. Again, speaking to the people when God said, "Speak to the rock." In addition to calling them rebels, biblical scholar Catherine Sackenfeld, she demonstrates the Hebrew form of this question can have at least 3 nuances. Let me try to bring out the nuances of Moses' question. Shall we bring water for you out of this rock? First, the first nuance is this: shall we or shall we not bring forth water? In this tone, the question would expect the people to beg the leaders for water. Despite God's command, just give it to them. Second nuance: can we bring forth water? This would invite the people to disbelieve in the power of God given to Moses and Aaron, or it might even suggest Moses and Aaron's own lack of faith. Can we bring forth water? The final nuance of the question is, shall we indeed bring forth water from this rock? This could be a rhetorical question, suggesting refusal to provide the people with water. A looser translation would be something like, why should we do this? You've given us so much grief in the wilderness. Perhaps this is why Moses doesn't follow God's command to speak to the rock. He doesn't want the people to have water. The name calling and aggressive or even potentially faithless question asking of Moses suggests he's a bit emotionally flooded at this moment. He's not thinking clearly in this scene. This is the insight of Psalm 106, which looks back on this incident from the book of Numbers. This is how the earliest readers of the Bible understood what happened in this story. Psalm 106, 32 to 33, if you're taking notes. They angered him at the waters of Meribah, and it went ill with Moses on their account, for they made his spirit bitter, and he spoke rashly with his lips. I've referenced the book, The Land Between, written by a great pastor on what happens to us in the book of Numbers. Jeff Mannion is the guy's name. Highly recommend the book. One of his observations is the land between is fertile ground for emotional collapse. And that's really the insight of Psalm 106, that Moses is having a moment of emotional collapse here. He spoke rashly with his lips. They made his spirit bitter. So again, I think it's instructive for us to turn to the book of Proverbs to see what we do what we should do instead for our own moments of emotional collapse. Here's 3 Proverbs. Proverbs 16:32. Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Proverbs 14:29. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. And finally, Proverbs 15:18. A hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. 3 Proverbs, 1 theme: slow to anger. When it comes to our emotions in the wilderness, slow down. Here's something I've learned my 46 years of life. I realize some of you have a lot more experience than that, but this is something, even in my short life, I have picked up. Emotions are great at signaling that something is wrong. They are terrible at helping us identify precisely what is wrong. To identify what is wrong takes time, reflection, wise counsel. Emotions deceive us. Don't leave before you learn. Don't leave the wilderness before you learn that lesson of the wilderness. During my last sabbatical in 2024, I took my coach's advice and I structured my time to give myself the best chance to learn how to show up differently. Instead of just saying, I'm gonna take time off, what could I do to learn? I spent 5 weeks in a one-bedroom above garage apartment in Durham, North Carolina, finishing up a writing project that brought me systematically through the events that were lingering in my life, leading to this precipice of burnout. Was it hard to do a writing project on the sabbatical? Of course it was. But did the burnout subside when I came back? I can also greatly report, yes, it did. It wasn't just time out of the wilderness. It was time learning the lessons of that wilderness season and how to apply them on into the future. And so I just have one question for application this morning. I don't want to have several because I think this demands some real thought, some real reflection if we're going to get it. What lesson do you need to learn before you leave your current wilderness? What is the lesson God is pressing into your life that you've got to take with you, or else you're just going to be right back in that same place in a matter of months? What lesson do you need to learn before you leave your current wilderness? Before you come up with your final answer to that question, Numbers 20 has one more lesson for us to consider, and that's this. Even Moses fails in the wilderness. Verse 11. And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. This phrase, lifted up his hand, is key. It's a direct quote from Numbers 15. It's a sermon I wanted to have in this series, but there are only so many weeks in the summer, so I'll give you a touch about it right now. Numbers 15 is a section about the difference between unintentional sin and intentional sin. The chapter fascinatingly prescribes sacrifices for unintentional sin, but is silent on how to atone for intentional sin. In that passage, intentional sin is referred to like this: anything done with a high hand. It's the same phrase used in Numbers 20. Moses lifted up his hand. Moses had a high hand. This is what it says in Numbers 15:30. The person who does anything with a high hand reviles the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among his people. Shockingly, in Numbers 20, Moses is the man with the high hand. He strikes the rock not once, but twice. It indicates that his sin is premeditated. He was never going to speak to the rock. It was intentional. He perpetrates his sin more than once. His actions revile the Lord. And Moses, even Moses, is cut off from among his people and he is allowed to see the promised land, but not to enter it. Think about this. Let me just press this in a little bit more. Moses, the friend of God. Moses, whose face shined after being in the presence of the Lord. Moses, the humblest man on the face of the earth. Moses, the one who mediated between God and the people after the golden calf incident and after their refusal to enter into the land. Even that Moses fails in the wilderness. Learn before you leave. Even Moses fails in the wilderness. So we need a mediator better than Moses in our wilderness. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 reveals this mediator, this better mediator for our wilderness. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are. That's the theme of this section of the series, temptation. We have a high priest who has been tempted in every respect as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need. We need a better mediator in our wilderness. In Jesus Christ, we have that better mediator. Numbers 20 begins with Miriam's death. That's Miriam who sang the victory song on the other side of the Red Sea and taught it to all of Israel. At the end of Numbers 20, Aaron dies. Aaron, who spoke on behalf of Moses the words of God to Pharaoh, the most powerful man on earth. And in the middle of the chapter in Numbers 20, we learn Moses will soon die too. He will die outside the promised land. One chapter, Numbers 20, highlights the death of all three of Israel's leaders. Even the greatest leaders of God's people fail. Which is why one of the things that we seek here at the chapel is to lead in such a way that points to Jesus Christ as the true pastor of his church. I am not the pastor of the chapel. Jesus is the pastor of the chapel. I am his under shepherd. And so with all our pastoral team and staff, don't leave. Don't try to leave. Don't try to run away from your wilderness before you run to Jesus, the better mediator in your wilderness. So this morning, pay attention. God rarely shows up the same way twice. Disobedience denies us what we long for. Our emotions, especially in the wilderness, can deceive. And even Moses fails in the wilderness. So let's run to the better mediator in our times of wilderness. Numbers 20 teaches us, don't leave before you learn. I pray this morning we would learn these lessons of the wilderness before we attempt to leave our wilderness.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. We hope you will join us as we listen for God to speak in the wilderness and allow Him to shape our lives through wilderness preparation, temptation, and invitation.